"Get down!" Sarah Collins' voice tore through the elegant silence of the restaurant, just as a masked man pulled a handgun from beneath his jacket. Time seemed to fracture. Crystal chandeliers reflected the flash of polished steel. Conversations froze. Expensive wine glasses slipped from trembling hands. At the center of the dining room sat Lorenzo De Luca, the most feared mafia boss on the East Coast, calmly finishing a sip of red wine as though death itself had arrived late for dinner. Dozens of armed capos reached for their weapons. None of them moved fast enough. Without thinking, Sarah lunged across the table. The bullet meant for Lorenzo slammed into her shoulder. The force threw her backward as gunfire erupted throughout the restaurant. Bodyguards flooded the room. Guests screamed and crawled beneath overturned tables. Within seconds, the assassin lay bleeding on the marble floor. Every soldier expected Lorenzo to order revenge. Instead, the man whose name terrified governors, billionaires, and rival mafia families dropped to his knees beside an injured waitress whose name he had never even asked. His hands shook. For the first time in decades, fear appeared in Lorenzo De Luca's eyes. Every morning began before sunrise. Sarah Collins woke to the soft mechanical rhythm of the dialysis machine that had become the soundtrack of her family's life. Before she even prepared herself for work, she checked on her father, adjusted his blanket, prepared breakfast, organized his medication, and made sure everything he needed would be within reach until she returned after midnight. Medical bills covered nearly every surface of the tiny apartment. She had stopped counting them months ago. Working double shifts at Bella Vita, one of Manhattan's most prestigious restaurants, was never part of her dream. It had simply become survival. The restaurant welcomed celebrities, hedge fund billionaires, politicians, and international royalty. Every table glittered beneath imported crystal. Every bottle of wine cost more than Sarah earned in several weeks. She served people who never looked at her. Or worse, looked only long enough to judge. Sarah was 31, noticeably plus-sized, with kind brown eyes that never seemed to lose their warmth despite years of humiliation. Her uniform was always perfectly pressed, her hair neatly tied back. Every movement reflected quiet professionalism, yet appearance often outweighed effort. "Can we have another waitress?" The request had become so common that the hostess barely reacted anymore. Sometimes customers whispered. Sometimes they laughed openly. Sometimes they pretended Sarah wasn't standing beside the table at all. "I ordered elegance," one woman once remarked, loudly enough for half the dining room to hear. "Not someone who looks like she sampled the entire menu." Laughter followed. Sarah smiled politely. "I'm sorry for any inconvenience, ma'am. I'll ask another server to assist you." She never argued. She never cried where anyone could see. Only in the staff locker room, during the few minutes she allowed herself before returning to work, did the weight of those words settle onto her shoulders. Her co-workers often wondered how she remained so calm. They didn't know. Every insult lasted only a moment. Her father's life depended on years of endurance. Compared to losing him, cruel words meant very little. Restaurant manager Daniel Pierce appreciated Sarah more than anyone else on the staff. Not because she was his fastest server. Not because she generated the largest tips, but because she never treated wealth as something that determined a person's value. She gave identical service to billionaires and delivery drivers. The wealthy rarely noticed. The ordinary people always did. One rainy Tuesday evening, an elderly couple entered Bella Vita, wearing inexpensive clothes that looked painfully out of place among designer suits and luxury dresses. Several servers quietly avoided the table. Sarah welcomed them with the same gentle smile she offered everyone else. Throughout the evening, she recommended affordable dishes without embarrassing them, quietly arranged smaller portions so they could share dessert, and never once allowed them to feel like they didn't belong. When they finished eating, the elderly man apologized. I'm afraid we can't leave much of a tip. Sarah smiled. You've already given me one. He looked confused. You reminded me what kindness looks like. The old woman reached across the table and squeezed Sarah's hand with watery eyes. Moments like those kept her going. Not money, not recognition, just knowing someone had left happier than they arrived. Late that same evening, Daniel received an unexpected phone call. His expression changed instantly. He straightened his jacket, ordered additional security, closed an entire private dining section, instructed the kitchen to prepare an exclusive tasting menu that wasn't even listed publicly. The staff exchanged curious glances. "Who is coming?" one waiter whispered. Daniel simply answered, "Our most important guest." Luxury vehicles quietly arrived outside just after sunset. Black SUVs lined the street. Men in tailored suits stepped out first, scanning every rooftop, every parked vehicle, every passing pedestrian. Inside the restaurant, no one recognized them. They looked like successful businessmen. Only Daniel understood the importance of absolute discretion. He personally escorted the mysterious reservation into the private dining room. Among them walked a man whose confidence required no introduction. Tall, impeccably dressed, dark eyes that seemed capable of reading every person's intentions before they spoke. Lorenzo De Luca entered without demanding attention, yet the atmosphere changed the instant he crossed the room. People instinctively lowered their voices. Even without knowing his name, they sensed power. Sarah happened to glance toward the private section while carrying another table's dessert. Their eyes met for barely a second. Unlike countless others that day, Lorenzo did not immediately look away, nor did he stare with judgment. It was simply a brief moment. Two strangers crossing paths. Sarah continued walking. Neither of them realized that before the night was over, one decision made in less than a single heartbeat would alter both of their lives forever. The private dining room had been reserved under a name that meant nothing to the restaurant staff. Only Daniel knew the guests inside were not ordinary businessmen. Even then, he knew only enough to understand one rule. Nothing could go wrong tonight. Sarah balanced a silver tray carrying a bottle of Barolo that had been aged longer than she had been alive. Before entering the room, she took a quiet breath and reminded herself that every table deserved the same care, whether they were celebrities or complete strangers. She knocked softly. "Your wine, gentlemen." The room fell silent for a brief moment. 6 men sat around the table. Every one of them wore tailored suits that concealed athletic frames. Their expressions remained unreadable, but their eyes never stopped moving. They weren't looking at the menu. They were watching entrances, windows, reflections, hands. Instinctively, Sarah understood they were protecting someone. Only after placing the bottle on the table did she notice the man seated at its center. The same man she had briefly passed earlier that evening. Lorenzo De Luca. He acknowledged her with nothing more than a polite nod. Unlike many wealthy customers, he never examined her appearance before speaking. "Thank you." 2 simple words. They caught Sarah off guard. Most VIP guests treated waitstaff like furniture. This man did not. She poured the wine carefully. The conversation resumed. It wasn't loud enough for her to hear clearly, but fragments drifted through the room. "The ports. Shipment arrives Friday. The governor accepted." Nothing sounded illegal. Nothing sounded threatening. Just powerful people discussing powerful business. Sarah finished serving and quietly excused herself. For the next 20 minutes, the evening unfolded normally. Orders came from neighboring tables. Desserts left the kitchen. Champagne corks echoed through the dining room. Outside, rain continued falling against the tall glass windows. Inside, the orchestra played softly, Then something changed. It wasn't obvious. Most people never noticed. Sarah did. A man entered the restaurant alone. Dark baseball cap, cheap jacket, wet shoes despite the valet entrance. He paused just inside the doorway, not to admire the room, to count exits. His eyes never lingered on the decor. They searched faces, then settled toward the private dining area. Sarah felt an uncomfortable tightening in her stomach. Years of serving thousands of customers had quietly sharpened her instincts. People who belonged somewhere behaved differently. This man looked like he was memorizing distances. He refused the hostess, ignored available tables, pretended to check his phone while inching closer to Lorenzo's room. One of the bodyguards noticed him, only briefly, then looked away after seeing what appeared to be an ordinary customer. Sarah kept watching. The stranger reached beneath his jacket. Not quickly, slowly, almost carefully. Her heartbeat accelerated. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe she was imagining danger where none existed. If she spoke up and was wrong, she would embarrass herself. Perhaps lose her job. She looked again. The man's eyes had changed. Cold, focused, committed. He wasn't searching anymore. He had chosen. Everything happened in less than 2 seconds. The stranger shoved open the dining room door. His arm came up. Steel flashed beneath the lights. Someone shouted, "Gun!" The first shot exploded through the restaurant. Crystal shattered. People screamed. Several capos instinctively reached inside their jackets. But surprise had stolen precious fractions of a second. Lorenzo had just begun turning toward the sound. The barrel pointed directly at him. Sarah didn't think. She moved. The tray slipped from her hands, crashing against the marble floor. She sprinted. One desperate step. Then another. She threw herself across the table just as another shot rang out. A burning impact tore through her shoulder. The force spun her sideways before she crashed onto the polished floor. Pain flooded her body so suddenly that she couldn't breathe. More gunfire erupted. The bodyguards responded instantly. Muzzle flashes illuminated the room. Tables overturned. Guests crawled toward the exits. Within moments, the assassin collapsed beneath a storm of bullets. Silence followed, broken only by alarms, and Sarah's uneven breathing. Blood spread slowly across the white sleeve of her uniform. One capo stared at her in disbelief. Another lowered his weapon, unable to process what he had witnessed. No one had ever willingly stepped in front of a bullet meant for Lorenzo De Luca. Not for money, not for loyalty, not even for family. Yet this waitress had done it, without knowing who he truly was. Lorenzo knelt beside her. His expensive suit darkened as it touched the blood pooling across the marble floor. "Stay with me." His voice remained calm, but his hands betrayed him. They trembled. A medic rushed forward. "We need pressure." Lorenzo removed his own jacket without hesitation and pressed it firmly against Sarah's wound. She tried to smile despite the pain. "Is everyone all right?" The question stunned everyone in the room. She hadn't asked whether she would survive. She hadn't asked who would pay her hospital bills. She hadn't even asked who the man beside her was. She wanted to know whether everyone else was safe. One of the capos quietly looked away. Another swallowed hard. They had spent decades believing courage belonged only to armed men. Tonight, an unarmed waitress had shattered that belief. Paramedics burst through the entrance moments later. As they lifted Sarah onto the stretcher, her eyes drifted toward Lorenzo. "I'm sorry," he frowned. "For what?" "The wine." She glanced weakly toward the shattered bottle. "It was probably expensive. For the first time in years." Lorenzo almost laughed, not because it was funny, because he had never met anyone capable of worrying about spilled wine after taking a bullet for a complete stranger. The ambulance doors closed. Its sirens disappeared into the rainy Manhattan night. Inside the restaurant, no one spoke. One by one, Lorenzo's capos gathered around him. Finally, his oldest advisor broke the silence. "Boss!" Lorenzo never looked away from the ambulance lights, fading into the distance. "What is her name?" No one answered. Not one man in the room knew. The woman who had just saved the most powerful mafia boss in America was still simply the waitress. 3 days later, sunlight filtered through the hospital blinds as Sarah slowly opened her eyes. The antiseptic smell reached her before the memories did. Then everything came rushing back. The restaurant, the gunfire, the sharp explosion of pain, the man she had pushed out of the bullet's path. Instinctively, she tried to sit up. A dull ache shot through her shoulder, forcing her back against the pillow. The door opened. A nurse stepped inside with a warm smile. "Good morning, Miss Collins. How long have I been here?" 3 days. Sarah's eyes widened. "My father." "Don't worry." The nurse smiled again. "Someone arranged private home nurses for him the same night you were admitted." Sarah frowned. "I can't afford private nurses." "You didn't pay for them." The nurse hesitated. A gentleman insisted. Sarah already suspected who that gentleman was. Her stomach tightened. She had never wanted to owe anyone anything, especially not a stranger. By the end of the week, Sarah was finally strong enough to leave the hospital. Outside the entrance, a sleek black luxury sedan waited quietly. Beside it stood a man in an immaculate dark suit. He stepped forward respectfully. "Miss Collins?" "Yes. My name is Marco." He extended a small envelope. "Mr. Lorenzo De Luca asked me to give this to you." Sarah accepted it cautiously. Inside was a handwritten note. "Thank you will never be enough. Please allow me to help." There was also a bank check. Sarah stared at the number. $5 million. She thought it was a mistake. She looked again. It wasn't. Her hands immediately folded the check back into the envelope. "I'm sorry." She handed it back. "I can't accept this." Marco blinked. "Excuse me? I didn't save him for money. You don't understand?" "No." Sarah smiled gently. "I think I do." She placed the envelope back into Marco's hands. "If Mr. De Luca truly wants to thank me..." She paused. "Tell him to donate it to families who can't afford dialysis." Marco had spent 15 years working for Lorenzo. He had delivered fortunes, luxury homes, sports cars, private islands. He had never, not once, seen anyone refuse the boss, especially $5 million. That evening, Marco entered Lorenzo's penthouse overlooking Manhattan. The room fell silent as he placed the untouched envelope on the table. Lorenzo looked up. "She accepted?" Marco slowly shook his head. "No, boss." Lorenzo frowned. "She wanted more?" "No." Marco slid the handwritten note back toward him. "She returned everything." For several seconds, nothing happened. Finally, Lorenzo asked quietly, "What did she say?" Marco repeated every word exactly. "Donate it to families who can't afford dialysis." Silence settled across the room. One capo chuckled. "She's negotiating." Another nodded. "Everyone has a price." Lorenzo looked at them without expression. "No." His voice was calm. "You've simply never met someone whose price isn't money." The room became silent again. A week later, Sarah returned to Bella Vita. The scar beneath her bandage still hurt whenever she reached above shoulder level. Daniel met her at the entrance. "You shouldn't be working yet." She smiled. "I have rent." And medical bills. And my father. I'll survive. Daniel sighed. You always do. The news of the shooting had spread across New York, but the restaurant had deliberately hidden Sarah's identity from the media. Most customers never realized the quiet waitress serving their meals had recently become the reason America's most feared mafia boss was still alive. Sarah preferred it that way. She wanted normal. She wanted routine. She wanted life to continue. Around noon, a familiar black SUV stopped outside the restaurant. Every employee froze. Several sharply dressed men entered first. Then, Lorenzo De Luca walked inside. The entire dining room instinctively became quieter. Daniel hurried forward nervously. It's an honor. Lorenzo nodded politely. I'm here to see Miss Collins. Sarah stepped from behind the service counter. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Then Lorenzo smiled slightly. I'm relieved to see you standing. So am I. I owe you my life. You owe me nothing. His eyebrow lifted. You took a bullet for me. I took a bullet for someone. She corrected him gently. If another person had been sitting there, I would have done the same. Those words landed harder than any accusation. Because Lorenzo believed her. She wasn't trying to impress him. She wasn't seeking favor. She was simply telling the truth. He invited her to sit for coffee after her shift. At first she refused. Then Daniel quietly whispered, Go. You deserve at least one conversation. So she agreed. Not because he was powerful, because refusing forever would become awkward. They met in a quiet cafe overlooking Central Park. For the first time in years, Lorenzo wasn't surrounded by bodyguards. They remained outside, far enough away to give them privacy. He watched Sarah stir sugar into her tea. You know who I am now? She nodded. I looked you up. And? You have a complicated reputation. He almost smiled. That's a polite way of saying people fear me. I don't know you well enough to fear you. You probably should. Sarah looked directly into his eyes. I've already stood in front of a bullet. I'm not sure fear gets much bigger than that. For the first time in a very long time, someone had spoken to Lorenzo without calculation, without intimidation, without pretending, just honesty. It was strangely refreshing. Their conversations slowly became more frequent. Never extravagant. Never romantic. Sometimes they discussed books. Sometimes Sarah spoke about her father. Sometimes Lorenzo asked what it felt like to work 16-hour shifts while constantly smiling at strangers. She answered truthfully. Most people aren't cruel. They're just distracted. And the ones who are cruel? They're usually carrying pain they don't know how to put down. Lorenzo stared at her. He had spent 2 decades studying betrayal, violence, power, greed. Yet this woman insisted on looking for wounds instead of enemies. It made no sense, which was exactly why he couldn't stop thinking about her. Weeks later, Marco quietly approached Lorenzo after another meeting. You've changed, boss. Lorenzo looked up. How? You listen more. You lose your temper less. You've cancelled 3 retaliations. You even approved funding for children's hospitals. Marco hesitated. Is this because of Miss Collins? Lorenzo looked toward the city skyline, stretching beyond the glass walls. For the first time in decades, he didn't answer immediately, because deep down, he already knew the truth. Sarah Collins had never asked him for money, never asked for influence, never asked for protection. Without realizing it, she had asked something infinitely more difficult. She had challenged the most powerful mafia boss in America to become a better man. Nearly 4 months had passed since the shooting. The story had quietly disappeared from the headlines, But inside New York's most influential circles, one question remained unanswered. Who was the ordinary waitress who had changed Lorenzo De Luca? Rumors spread faster than facts. Some claimed she had manipulated him. Others insisted she had planned the attack herself. Many simply refused to believe that genuine kindness could exist without an ulterior motive. Among those skeptics was Victor Hayes. On paper, Victor was a celebrated entrepreneur, philanthropist, and generous donor to countless charities. Behind closed doors, he laundered millions of dollars for one of Lorenzo's rival mafia families. He understood power. He understood greed. He understood leverage. What he could not understand was sacrifice without profit. When he learned Lorenzo had been spending time with Sarah Collins, he laughed. A waitress? There has to be more. He ordered investigators to dig into every detail of her life. Within days, they returned with disappointingly ordinary results. No hidden fortune, no political connections, no criminal history, just unpaid medical bills. Long shifts, and a daughter quietly keeping her father alive. Victor found that almost insulting. Nobody stays that clean. If she won't reveal a weakness, I'll create one. His opportunity arrived at the annual Manhattan Children's Hope Gala. The event attracted politicians, billionaires, celebrities, judges, diplomats, and nearly every powerful business leader on the East Coast. Lorenzo rarely attended public charity events. This year, he accepted the invitation. Not for publicity, because Sarah had convinced him that anonymous generosity changed lives more than public reputation ever could. Sarah almost declined the invitation herself. She owned only one formal dress. It wasn't designer. It wasn't expensive. She worried she wouldn't belong. Lorenzo smiled when she admitted her concern. The people worth impressing won't notice your dress, and the people who notice aren't worth impressing. His words eased her anxiety, but they could not silence the whispers that followed her into the ballroom. Crystal chandeliers illuminated the enormous hall. Champagne flowed freely. Orchestras played softly in the background. Every guest seemed perfectly polished. Sarah suddenly felt like the same invisible waitress she had always been. Only this time, everyone was looking. Some recognized her from quiet rumors. Others merely noticed she stood beside Lorenzo. That alone was enough to spark curiosity. Victor approached with an effortless smile. Lorenzo. The two men shook hands. Their smiles never reached their eyes. Victor turned toward Sarah. And this must be the famous heroine. Sarah offered a polite smile. It's nice to meet you. Victor nodded thoughtfully, before speaking loud enough for nearby guests to hear. I've heard remarkable stories. Although, he glanced around dramatically. I've always wondered whether gratitude has become rather expensive these days. Several guests exchanged amused looks. Sarah understood exactly what he meant. She answered calmly, I wouldn't know. Victor continued, I suppose being close to the most powerful man on the East Coast comes with certain advantages. A few quiet laughs drifted through the crowd. Lorenzo's expression hardened. Before he could speak, Sarah gently touched his arm, a silent request. Please don't. Victor noticed. He smiled wider. You see, she's smart. She knows better than to let the boss fight every battle. More laughter. Another guest added, from waitress to high society. That's quite the promotion. Someone else whispered loudly. Luck really does change lives. Sarah felt every word, not because they embarrassed her, but because they revealed how little these people understood. She looked toward the exit. Perhaps leaving quietly was the wiser choice. She had never wanted attention. She certainly didn't want Lorenzo dragged into another public confrontation because of her. She gave him a small smile. I think I'll head home. He looked into her eyes. He immediately understood why. She wasn't running away. She was protecting him. Again. Sarah turned and began walking toward the ballroom doors. The room slowly resumed its conversations. Victor lifted his champagne glass, satisfied. He believed he had won. He had no idea. Everything was about to change. Sarah. Lorenzo's voice echoed through the ballroom. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The room fell completely silent. Sarah stopped walking. Slowly, she turned. Lorenzo placed his champagne glass onto a nearby table. Then, without hurry, he walked directly across the ballroom. Past senators, past billionaires, past judges, past mafia leaders. No one dared interrupt him. He stopped in front of Sarah. For several seconds, he simply looked at her. Then he turned toward the hundreds of guests watching. "You're all wrong." Silence deepened. The night everyone else reached for their guns, she reached for me. No one moved. No one breathed. Lorenzo continued. "I've spent my entire life surrounded by powerful people. People who promised loyalty. People who promised respect. People who promised they'd die for me." His eyes swept across the ballroom. When the bullets came, every promise disappeared beneath instinct. He looked back at Sarah. This woman had made no promise. She knew nothing about me. She didn't know my name. She didn't know my wealth. She didn't know my influence. She only saw another human being about to die. His voice softened. Power earned me fear. Wealth earned me respect. My reputation earned me obedience. He paused. But this woman earned something no empire could ever buy. My heart. A quiet gasp rippled through the ballroom. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, not because of the confession, but because every word came from complete sincerity. Lorenzo stepped closer. He gently reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. "I've negotiated with presidents. I've defeated men who believed they were untouchable. But meeting you was the first time I realized strength has nothing to do with power." He smiled. "You saved my life. But without trying, you saved the man I was becoming." The silence became overwhelming. Then something extraordinary happened. Marco, Lorenzo's oldest capo, stepped forward. Without receiving a single order, he knelt before Sarah. One by one, another capo followed, then another. Then another, until every mafia leader in the ballroom knelt in complete silence before the woman who had once been mocked as just a fat waitress. Not because Lorenzo demanded it, because each of them knew one undeniable truth. She had protected the man they had sworn to protect, at the cost of her own life. Victor's face turned pale. For the first time in years, he understood what real honor looked like, and it had nothing to do with wealth. The months that followed transformed many lives. Sarah never moved into a mansion. She never asked for expensive jewelry. She never abandoned the small apartment where she had cared for her father for so many years. Instead, together, she and Lorenzo opened a community restaurant unlike any other in New York. Every weekend, struggling families received warm meals without paying a single dollar. No questions, no paperwork, no embarrassment. Those who could afford to donate quietly covered the meals of those who could not. Sarah insisted on greeting every guest personally. She remembered names. She listened to stories. She made people feel seen, exactly as she had done years earlier while serving tables. Only now, her kindness reached thousands instead of dozens. Lorenzo funded the project. Sarah gave it its soul. Even Lorenzo's organization began changing in unexpected ways. The scholarship programs replaced vanity projects. Medical foundations expanded. Children's hospitals received anonymous donations worth millions. When reporters tried to praise Lorenzo for his generosity, He always redirected the attention. I had the resources. She showed me the purpose. One afternoon, nearly a year after the shooting, a young journalist interviewed Lorenzo outside the restaurant. "What was the greatest investment you ever made?" Lorenzo smiled as he watched Sarah laughing with a little girl who had just helped decorate cupcakes in the kitchen. "I never invested in her." The reporter looked confused. Lorenzo's smile grew warmer. "She invested her life in mine, before she even knew my name." Across the room, Sarah looked up and caught his eyes. The same gentle smile she had offered strangers for years appeared once again. Only now, someone finally understood its true worth. The guests inside the restaurant didn't see a mafia boss and a former waitress. They saw two people who had changed each other in the rarest way possible. One had offered protection, the other had offered redemption. And together, they proved that the most valuable things in life could never be purchased. They could only be earned.